The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Good morning, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org radio with Global Alert News for Saturday, October 10th, 2015. In a moment, we'll go over some of the current headlines, as I'll do every week, from CNN, Fox, and the same headlines are on other mainstream agencies as well, to try to continue to point out how incredibly ridiculous a world we live in right now is when we have to accept the sort of completely irrelevant nonsense that we're fed from the idiot box all week long, and how many people are unfortunately influenced by that. Again, I'll give some of the headlines from the mainstream corporate media every week so that we can illustrate the fact that we're all passengers on a runaway juggernaut of total distraction and insanity. When the headlines I'm about to read are considered against the background of total biosphere destruction, with climate engineering at the top of the list, imminent world conflict, with many of the pieces of the puzzle already being maneuvered into place by global powers. This is happening at breakneck speed. Critical resource depletion is happening on countless fronts. Dozens of countries around the globe are descending into chaos, and a very long list of other untold, extremely critical stories, like the major historical California nuclear catastrophe, which we talked about last week, that I'm sure almost nobody had heard about that issue, that was worse than 3 Mile Island. None of this has yet to be mentioned by mainstream media. So let's consider the following stories from our so-called media. And it becomes truly evident that they are nothing but a mechanism of mass distraction to keep the public's focus off the fact that the world is burning to the ground, quite literally, in many places. Current headlines from CNN for this week. Ask yourself how much this matters against the backdrop of the bigger picture. Marco Rubio, everywhere but on CNN. Why would that matter? High school athlete collapses. Certainly it matters to the parents, but wouldn't the whole biosphere collapsing matter a little more? Mom's photos spark outrage. This is all from CNN, by the way. Military may get its Iron Man. Well, that's just what we need, is more military mechanisms of destruction. $310 million Powerball winner is, and the headline goes on, did a botched call cost an NFL team? Well, that would be of immense importance, wouldn't it? We wouldn't want anything going wrong in the football arena. When Leno didn't show up for Letterman, why the hell would that matter, given what we have happening around the globe? Here's one last headline from CNN. How to save cash at Disney parks. That's what the power structure would like us all to do, is just buy tickets to Disneyland and ram our head further into the sand. How about Fox News? Because, after all, everyone knows that Fox is, quote, fair and balanced, right? How balanced are they? Here's some headlines from Fox News. Let's see. Media buzz. Why Sanders is shattering the media's expectations. This is all theater, absolute theater, with any of this political nonsense. It doesn't matter who the candidate is. It doesn't matter what side of the political fence he's on. It's all theater. Period. Hillary hopes to beat the rap on technicality, the email story that they milk on and on. And again, I have no love for Hillary Clinton. I can't imagine having her for a president or even in any role in the government. But the bottom line is it's all mass distraction. Another headline from Fox. Illegal wind turbine leaves green energy entrepreneur spinning in jail. As if that really matters in the bigger picture. Here's an important one. Stephen Mabry takes on Michael Jordan over price of sneakers. That's important. Workers remove Ten Commandments monument from Oklahoma Capitol grounds. They can always create a lot of distraction with any sort of religious conflict that people become so biased and polarized over that they miss the big picture. They miss what the power structure is really doing. New Mexico Secretary of State accused of dozens of corruption charges. Well, the entire governmental structure, with few exceptions, is completely corrupt. Nazis tried to use candy bars as a secret weapon. Where did they dig that one up? Again, this is all Fox News. Department of Defense says U.S. airstrikes mistakenly struck Afghan hospital. Oops. What went wrong there? How many people really take a good hard look at that? What if Russia did that? Wow, it would be headlines everywhere, every day, for who knows how long. But not when it happens from our military. And I'm not faulting our military brothers and sisters, but I'm faulting whoever's at the top, whoever's pulling the levers, whoever's using them for tools against their own people. Here's another important Fox headline. Tiny but fierce creature scares off big bears. Tourist falls to her own death while taking photos. You get the idea. The bottom line is, oh, here's another one I missed, I'm sorry. 1.8 million Cheerios boxes recalled. Oh, I wouldn't want to miss that one. You get the idea. Bottom line, again, while the biosphere is collapsing, industrialized civilization is continuing toward total collapse. It's not my opinion. I know a lot of people listen to this and they want to shake their heads and convince themselves that I'm just an alarmist and that this is all nonsense and they can make a joke out of it. You won't be laughing for long. You won't be. What's happening around us is real. The denial is unbelievable. But you can't stay in denial once the walls close in, and they're closing in very rapidly. The U.S. corporate media's job is to distract, confuse, and program the masses with power structure serving propaganda. Only a few years ago, CNN, for example, had 24-hour-a-day world news coverage and national news coverage on a separate channel. For several years now, the world news has been replaced with travesties like Nancy Grace and other reality shows. If you've never seen Nancy Grace, it's truly unbelievable, the sort of nonsense that goes on in some of these channels that used to be news channels. So what's going on in the news, really? Much more than I can cover here, but let's try. How's the global economic house of cards? Here's a few recent headlines. This is real news that most of our media sources don't tell us about. These are just headlines. World Bank trims Asia growth forecast as China worries drag down economies. Another headline, IMF cuts global growth forecasts again, cites commodity and China worries. Another headline, economists chase tails and cut GDP estimates again. Another headline, Ukraine economy to fall, gross domestic product to shrink by 12%, says World Bank. A few more headlines to go. Brazil unemployment rate soars as workers brace for tighter economic squeeze. Another headline, commodity collapse has more to go as Goldman to Citi see losses. Emerging market ETF outflows double as losses hit $12 billion. Panic buying of super liquid treasuries. A few more headlines. German factory orders unexpectedly fall. Why would it be unexpected? This is where we live in a delusional world where people in certain corporate circles talk about the growth that's going to occur in the next 10 and 20, 30 years with absolutely no reference to the fact that, oh, by the way, the biosphere is imploding around us. And on the current trajectory, none of us will be here in that time frame. That's not part of their picture. And so it's not part of the population's picture as well, because no one wants to believe what's happening. But the more you ignore it, the less chance we have to salvage anything. A last couple headlines. Glencore stocks are crashing. Volkswagen's CEO scandal will force big spending cuts at Volkswagen. Unemployment figures are falsified, really, as if we didn't know that. Those are real news stories that most don't want to believe. They simply don't want to believe it. A few more, because this is important to hear what's happening around the globe that we're not being told, like in Ukraine, for example. Ukraine war deserters, 16,000 troops leave Ukrainian army. We don't hear much about that because we're fed such a pack of lies about what's happening in Ukraine and why it happened. It couldn't be much further from the truth. People need to understand that this is all geopolitical maneuvering, as I've gone over in the past with Brzezinski's grand chessboard to control these Asian countries and the sort of destabilization that our country and other NATO powers have been behind in recent years. The list is long. Russia would consider airstrikes in Iraq at Baghdad's request. Baghdad is now asking Russia to help because our military is not helping. Not because our military is not capable. Certainly our military is the most capable in the world. But because it's not the goal of those in power to actually stop the terrorists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups which they helped spawn, fund, and arm to begin with. Why? To create the kind of chaos they need to carry out their agenda. That's the fact of the matter. I'm not in love with Russia at all. But I'm simply saying, in this particular case, we have Russia willing to knock out the terrorists when our country clearly has desired only to create more chaos. So, again, back to the Afghan hospital bombing that just happened that was absolutely horrific. And I state, if Russia did that, how much news would occur if Russia was at fault? And we have here, even CNN's Jake Tripper went on the air yesterday to state that the U.S. should support the moderate rebels in Syria. They're not rebels, they're terrorists. And whatever we think of Assad, that was the legitimate government of the country. And since when does the U.S. get to decide what government to topple and what government to support? Saudi Arabia is an absolutely tyrannical country. The women are treated like prisoners, not slaves, but prisoners. People are hung headless. This happened 2 weeks ago from cranes in the middle of cities, hung headless bodies. And we support that country. It's all about who is considered beneficial to the power structure and who's not. So those are headlines that we should look at. And again, for a lot of those headlines, if you simply search online rice farmer, I know it's a strange name, but if you search rice farmer blogspot, you'll find no advertising, no politics. A rice farmer in Japan puts this together. It's a really, really comprehensive site with just subtitles and a lot of data. Back to ISIS for a moment. Let's remember that this barbaric, murderous group was spawned, funded, and armed by the Western power structure. Let's also not forget that Senator John McCain has been photographed with ISIS leaders and has stated on film and on the record that he is, quote, intimate with these leaders, that he communicates to them all the time. Now the U.S. is furious about Russia actually bombing the terrorists in Syria. Again, why? Because actually getting rid of these terrorists, that wasn't in the goal for the Western power structure. Again, that spawned them in the first place. In the fight against Syrian terrorists, Russia has done in days what the NATO powers have not accomplished in many months. Again, this is only due to the fact that it was never the goal for those at the top of the Western power structure to actually get rid of the terrorists, but rather to use them as tools of destabilization and regime change. I fully recognize the men and women in the U.S. military, as I stated earlier, are completely capable of doing what Russia did and much more, if they were allowed to, if that was really the goal. But it's not the goal. Just like in Vietnam and so many other instances, the very goal is conflict for the Western power structure and the military-industrial complex. The curtain's being pulled back on the U.S. and its allies that have been orchestrating not just countries around the globe, but orchestrating much against their own populations. A quick rewind to previous shows I've done, and to weave this all together. The events of 9/11 were exactly what the Washington military-industrial think tanks stated they needed long before 9/11 occurred. They referred to the need for a new Pearl Harbor event. Think about that, a new Pearl Harbor event, something to catalyze the population to support their militarization and occupation. 9/11 then becomes the license for invading foreign nations and to strip the rights from the U.S. population. The dumping of posse comitatus, the so-called Patriot Act, all are needed to open their eyes and actually do some real objective investigation of the facts. All of us are needed for this, to connect the dots. We're not just being led to the slaughter. The slaughter has long since been underway. Those who rule the world are attracted by power. They're addicted to power. They've been consumed by power. There's no cure for them. All of us have to open our eyes while there's still something left to salvage. What about the weather? Hurricane Joaquin update. I mentioned it last week. I'll finish it now. Encourage everyone to examine the maps and data that I posted at geoengineeringwatch.org that highlighted just how anomalous this storm was in so many ways. There was an unprecedented list of converging conditions that caused a firehouse of moisture to inflict catastrophic damage to South Dakota. Were these conditions just natural variability? Without speculation, we can say absolutely not. When we can clearly see massive aerosol spraying on satellite imagery and all around this storm and in its storm track, that alone eliminates any conclusion of this weather system being natural. Now we can add to the long list of other unprecedented factors that have climate engineering written all over them. Again, examine the article and on geoengineeringwatch.org, and the title of this article is Engineering 1,000-Year Weather Catastrophes, the Reality of Weather Warfare. This is in the upper right under the recent column of geoengineeringwatch.org. How's the weather in the rest of the world? And the weather matters. It's not just a topic of conversation. When our climate disintegrates, that's the end of the road for us. And the climate is disintegrating. Look up. Every day our skies look like something from another planet, most days. Trees are dying everywhere. The forests are silent. There's almost no insects. It's time to wake up. So here's the headline from the UK from, I believe, November 5th. Sizzling UK records hottest day ever. Think about that. That's in October. The highest ever temperature in Britain has been recorded, weather forecasters said. A temperature of 99.3 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded at Heathrow around 1:30 p.m. That is hot for Britain. Hottest day ever. What about on the other side of the world? What's going on in Australia? Here's another headline that our media doesn't talk about because they're talking about the price of sneakers, as we saw on Fox News. Records broken as temperatures soar up to 38 degrees across Australia. It's only early spring there. The headline continues. Victoria and South Australia, the colder end of Australia, by the way, both set records for the hottest ever starts to October, while in Sydney the temperature reached 37 degrees, near 100. Weather records were broken across Australia as the temperatures reached 38 degrees in some parts of the country. What's the overall weather around the world doing? Again, one more headline. The headline reads, Broken Records 2015, hottest summer, hottest August, hottest first 8 months. It's also been the hottest last 12 months. 2014 was the hottest year until this year, which will break last year. 2016 will break 2015. Of course, the western U.S. continues to fry under record-shattering heat and drought. For a very thorough update on Hurricane Joaquin and what just happened, examine the article that I mentioned again earlier, Engineering 1,000-Year Weather Catastrophes, the Reality of Weather Warfare, at geoengineeringwatch.org. How's the weather in Northern California? As I mentioned earlier, hot and dry. It's almost always the case in our completely climate-engineered nightmare that we live in. It's like a different planet here than it was 15 years ago. It's completely different. People just ignore it and pretend it will go away. It's not going to go away. Even with total cloud cover, the hot and dry conditions continue in Northern California, with temperatures forecast to remain in the low to mid-90s, even well into October. In the 90s, perhaps even near the end of October. How many even wonder why the weather has gone completely wrong in recent years? And worse, all the time, it's getting worse. An unfortunately small number of people don't even take notice of our constantly hazy and silvery white skies. Though there's still plenty of days with the telltale horizon-to-horizon climate engineering sprayed particulate stripes, now there are many more days with much less visible spraying. But the hazy cobweb-like silvery white skies are solid indicators of what's going on in our skies. A recent study from NASA stated that the world is 67%, quote, mostly cloudy. Really? How did this happen? How can the atmosphere now be so full of microscopic aerosol particles? And for those who don't know what an aerosol is, it's just a finely suspended particle in the atmosphere. And again, these aerosols are the primary element named in geoengineering patents. And NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, says on the record that they have no idea where all these aerosol particles are coming from. In fact, in 2010, NOAA stated on the record that the total level of atmospheric particulates doubled from 2000 to 2010. And they had no idea where all these particles were coming from. Again, I asked, really, how can that be? They had no idea. The stated goal of solar radiation management is to fill the skies with light-scattering particles to create artificial cloud cover, with no regard for the consequences, of course. We're told that our air is getting cleaner thanks to all the strict pollution laws, but this is just Orwellian doublespeak. And again, I want to state, why does this climate thing matter so much? Why does geoengineering matter so much, even above the stories I mentioned earlier? Because how long can you hold your breath? How long can you live under a toxic sky? How long can you live on a planet that's dead, that doesn't have trees that produce oxygen, that doesn't have an ocean that's alive and producing oxygen, that can't produce fish? You can't live on that kind of a planet with temperatures that are soaring to levels that few can yet comprehend. That's the track we're on. That's why it matters. So back to the Orwellian doublespeak that these pollution laws are supposedly cleaning up our air. The regulated forms of pollution are going down, at least statistically. But what about the completely unregulated forms of deadly particulate pollution, particles that are much smaller than anything that's being tested for? That's what we're talking about, nanoparticulates, much smaller than any of the air testing, so none of it shows up. So no one says anything about this critical issue because they're paid not to say anything. Most people would struggle with that because they believe our government and our agencies are all here for our benefit. And I'm not saying that the local policeman on the street is not here to help, and I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying people in agencies that are supposed to protect the public health, water quality, air quality, they do what they're told. And they don't look for what they're told not to look for. And I know this. I've been in high-level EPA meetings. I've been in Barbara Boxer's office. I've been in Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom's office. I've spoken in front of the California Energy Commission. I've spoken in front of CARB. I've been at this a long time. I've had a lot of meetings with a lot of people that have told me to my face they were told not to look for certain things. Or else. Continuing with this point, official agencies and elected officials are paid to pacify an already unbelievably complacent population. So no matter how epidemic human health issues directly related to respiratory exposure of heavy metal particulates becomes, no matter how epidemic, issues like asthma, allergies, COPD, autism, Alzheimer's, respiratory mortality, and a whole lot more, the majority of people gulp down the nothing to worry about lies from agencies in order to remain in their bubbles of denial. How many people do we know that do this? Everything's fine, nothing to worry about. You're just being an alarmist. Meantime, the whole population is becoming sick. The forests are dying, burning to the ground. The climate's completely off the rails. The ocean's dying. Where would I stop? Every other commercial on the TV, something to do with the ailments just mentioned. Again, all these ailments I just went over. Why aren't the alarm bells going off? In regard to our skies, how many people even remember what truly blue skies look like? With brilliant white clouds that took your breath away. What do we have now? Often featureless, dry cloud canopies with occasional clusters of natural clouds that are blent into this canopy, almost melted in. If you look toward the horizon on a silvery white sky looking day, even if you don't see the horizon-to-horizon trails, if you look toward the horizon over the mountaintops, you can barely make out the natural white cumulus clouds that are so blent in with the background of sprayed particulates you can barely make them out. That's the world we live in now. The sprayed aerosol mess is a fact of life. So few seem to notice and care. But as I said before, they will soon. Does anyone remember Bush telling us just after 9/11 to simply go back to shopping and consuming and everything would be fine. What kind of mentality is that? What kind of responsible citizen, responsible father, responsible mother, responsible citizen would do that? Again, we're supposed to be here for the common good. It's not an option. It's an obligation. And the common good involves a little more than just going back to shopping and ignoring 9/11, because certainly they didn't want us to look at that fiasco and how ridiculous the official story is about 9/11. This programming must be broken. If we're to have any chance of even short-term survival, we must break the programming and the denial and the lack of sense of responsibility with the population. It's our responsibility to wake up. We owe this to our children. The walls are closing in on us from every side, most especially from above our heads with the lethal climate engineering insanity. When I was a small boy, about 11 or 12, I saw a documentary film that demonstrated how monkeys were caught and then extracted from the jungle. And this stayed with me. It struck me as very profound when it happened, and it absolutely stayed with me. They would tie a clear jar, to a tree, and a very attractive fruit was put inside that jar. And the monkey, being, of course, unable to resist the fruit, would reach his hand in and grasp it. And with the fruit in his hand, he couldn't get his hand out of the jar anymore, and thus he was unable to escape. His captors would then walk right up to the monkey while he was thrashing and screaming, but still the monkey would not let go. What a metaphor there was in this scene, and as I said, it struck a deep chord in me. I've recalled it countless times since. How many in our population, how many that we know, are so much like this example that they will not let go of the bubble of denial, of the delusion that what's happening around us is not happening. We should take an example from that metaphor. It's time to let go of that fruit, wake up while we still have something left to salvage. We have to abandon our completely programmed ideologies in exchange for facts. And not many do this. People all over the world adopt opinions from someone else who had an opinion, and nobody ever bothered to look for facts. You can't face reality that way. We have to wipe the slate clean, to look without preconceptions, without programming. We must do this if we're to have any chance of facing the challenges before us. So, where's all this leading? As I mentioned in previous shows, crops are failing around the globe. Starting with, I've mentioned Mongolia in the past, 80% of their crops have failed this year. So the global seed bank has opened for Syria to save the crops that have been lost to war. And the seed bank I refer to is in the Arctic. It's called the Doomsday Seed Vault. How many have heard of that? The Doomsday Seed Vault. This is built within the Arctic Circle. Bill Gates had a part in this, by the way. This vault contains several 100 million seed types. An astounding amount of seeds, a very big facility. This is not a secret. You can search this online. You can see photographs of the entrance. And that's what it's called, the Doomsday Seed Vault. What do they know that we don't know? This vault is already being opened because of what's happening around the globe. The headline I just read continues. The global seed bank opens for Syria to save crops lost to war. Syria has been facing extreme drought conditions for many years, according to a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This drought brought on by climate change, and already we see a lie, because the NATO powers have droughted out every single Middle Eastern country that has been toppled, and the leaders of some of those countries have been on the floor of the United Nations stating emphatically, publicly, that their countries, and they know, they have scientists, they have meteorologists, are being droughted out by NATO weather modification programs, but we don't hear that. So it never gets repeated, so the geoengineering elephant in the room goes ignored in every headline, but still I want to finish this headline just the same. This drought brought on by climate change contributed to the Syrian uprising. As I stated, all those countries were destabilized by drought before they were toppled by other means. And this headline admits it, contributed to the Syrian uprising that began in 2011. Now retrieving some of the seeds they put in the vault may be their only hope to revive their agricultural industry. Well, you can't revive an agricultural industry when the climate is too harsh. to support that industry. And for those that didn't know, we had a heat index in some of the Middle Eastern countries less than 2 months ago that hit 165 degrees. That's a heat index, not an actual temperature. But that is record-setting levels. Human beings have difficulty surviving at those levels. That's a temperature of about 125 degrees with a humidity of 50% or more. That's an astoundingly high heat index. How can you grow anything in that? And by the way, photosynthesis stops at 104 degrees. The planet is racing to a state where it will not support life. How are the oceans doing, by the way? Marine life plummets. Here's another headline. Marine life plummets and food security is at risk. This is a World Wildlife Federation report from September 16th, 2015. Recent report. And all these reports, by the way, are conservative. So as dire as they may sound, they're conservative from how bad things really are. Keep that in mind while I'm reading this. Nearly half of the world's marine mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish have been lost in a single generation, with frightening implications for human welfare and food security, according to a special emergency edition of World Wildlife Federation's Living Blue Planet report, released today, the 16th of September. The report by World Wildlife Federation and the Royal Zoological Society of London finds that marine vertebrate populations have declined by 49% between 1970 and 2012, with some fish declining by close to 75%. That's not entirely true. It's worse than that. Tuna populations have declined by well over 90%, as have some of the other pelagic fish populations, the food fish. The oceans are almost done, and food from the oceans is almost done. If you don't believe me, you will. All I asked is investigate. I'm not asking anybody to believe me. I only ask you to investigate these facts. Because, again, when Fox News is telling us about whatever Donald Trump is doing and whatever tennis shoes Michael Jordan is selling, this is what's going on in the real world. In the real world. The report continues. The analysis tracked 5,829 populations of 1,234 species, making the data sets almost twice as large as any past study and giving a clearer, much more troubling picture of ocean health. A direct quote from the article here. In the space of just one generation, human activity has severely damaged the ocean by catching fish faster than they can reproduce while also destroying their nurseries. Now, that statement from World Wildlife Federation makes it sound like that's the only cause. What the World Wildlife Federation is not mentioning in this dire report is this. There are factors relating to the dying of our oceans which are much more dire than overfishing. Fukushima is one, of course. The climate engineering elephant in the room is another, which they won't mention because they don't want to lose their nonprofit status. They don't want to be targeted, as they certainly would be, from governmental powers, because we all know what happens to whistleblowers, don't we? In every administration, going all the way back. This administration, the worst of all. They've prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined. They are in a war with whistleblowers. This particular administration, though all administrations have been bad. I'm not singling out any, but this one's the worst of all. GeoEngineering and its effect in the oceans, which World Wildlife Federation will not mention. Destroying the ozone layer. The very intense UV radiation is slaughtering global plankton. Plankton cannot take that radiation. They have to feed in the upper waters. And data indicates that the materials being used for solar radiation management, the intentional blocking of the sun by filling the atmosphere with light-scattering particles, those toxic particles are also being used for ocean fertilization, which means as those particles settle down to the sea surface and particles of various metal oxides are used for iron fertilization to cause an algae bloom from the organisms that are still left alive in the ocean, which sucks some of the carbon out of the atmosphere. That's the goal, to take some of the carbon out of the atmosphere. What's it do to the ocean? It kills the ocean. It deoxygenates the ocean, creates hypoxic and anoxic zones. So when I'm looking back at the World Wildlife Federation and their report that claims to tell the truth, it's less than a half-truth. They're omitting the greatest threats of all. Complete omission. GeoEngineering, Fukushima, ocean iron fertilization, complete omissions. So we have highly toxic, what amounts to industrial waste, and what may actually be industrial waste, because as I outlined in an earlier show, it appears that coal fly ash matches the chemical constituents that we see in rain tests, and this may be a base material that the climate engineers are using. It has a lot of the components they would want to use, components that would work for ocean iron fertilization. This is toxic industrial waste. And this forcing of the ocean to uptake more CO2 is over-acidifying an ocean that's already highly acidic, killing organisms. The ocean's 30% more acidic than before the Industrial Revolution. Many types of crustaceans are having difficulty forming their shells at all. The food chain is collapsing. It's collapsing right now. And again, there's a lot of various sources. In the Gulf, we have the Macondo oil spill. We have nuclear radiation that's been dumped in various places. There's a lot of factors going on here. But two of the biggest of all, not mentioned by World Wildlife Federation, Fukushima and GeoEngineering, which is the biggest of all. So as the food chain collapses, what happens? We're losing fish, birds, whales, seals. In fact, someone I know who is connected with the fishing industry in the Pacific Northwest has said that they have had officials boarding the fishing vessels, going out with the excursion, monitoring what's happening, and instructing those fishermen that they are not to talk to media about what's going on. Why would that be a surprise? Just like the U.S. Navy personnel that were told before they were allowed to leave the Ronald Reagan, the USS Reagan, that was exposed to Fukushima radiation, that they couldn't talk to media, and now they're suing. This is business as usual. So we see, or are told, that there was officials boarding some of the fishing fleets and instructing the fishermen that they were not to tell media that they are coming up with seals, dead, crammed into their crab traps, because the seals have nothing to eat, and they're at great depth trying to extract the bait from crab traps. That's how desperate they are. And by the way, we've lost 10 to 15,000 seals washed up on the shores of California in the last year, dead. Authorities claim to know nothing about it because, as I said earlier, that's what they're paid to do not understand what's happening. We have these massive fish kills. All the factors I already mentioned are there, plus we have an extremely warm ocean. And the fish kills, most want to blame directly on Fukushima. Radiation does not kill fish with that immediacy. But seabed gassing of methane and especially hydrogen sulfide does. And that is, in fact, going on. We had reports from Seattle at the beginning of the year, the rotten egg smell, telltale sign of hydrogen sulfide gassing from the seabed. Now, when that starts to happen, we are very close to calamity at a level that few can comprehend. Hydrogen sulfide is highly toxic. So as our record warm ocean, and again, those who think that the ocean's not record warm, those who are trying to convince themselves that there's no global warming, you're not helping in the battle against geoengineering. You're not helping. The climate science community will never, ever, even though they know geoengineering is going on, they will never associate with an anti-geoengineering movement that can't recognize the fact that the planet is warming. So we all need to stand on fact and reality. The planet's not just warming, it's in meltdown. Al Gore's data was all wrong. I agree with that. It's much worse than anything Gore said. Much worse. Maybe it's not popular for me to say that, but I could care less. I'm here to try to tell what the data dictates. Period. Look around. Don't believe me, don't believe NASA, don't believe NOAA. Look at what's happening on the ground. They're catching tuna in Alaska. They have. That's how warm the waters are there. In some places, 15 degrees above normal. Look around. That's all I'm asking. So again, where's all this leading? How bad is it? Food chains collapsing, crops collapsing, massive spraying over our heads, which is making all of us sicker. What else is the power structure doing? How about buying billions of rounds of ammunition for Homeland Security? Some know this happened, many don't know. But here's a headline from Forbes magazine. Forbes, this is not some fringe magazine. 1.6 billion rounds of ammo for Homeland Security. The headline continues, it's time for a national conversation. You think? When Homeland Security is buying 1.6 billion with a B rounds of ammunition, it's time for a conversation. That's the Forbes headline? Yeah, I would say it is. And Forbes took this from the Denver Post, so I'm going to continue with an excerpt from this article. The Denver Post on February 15th, this is from 2 years ago, most people, again, haven't heard this yet, ran an Associated Press article entitled Homeland Security Aims to Buy 1.6 Billion Rounds of Ammo. Now, the final figure was 2.4 billion. So far, little have noticed. This is directly from their headline, their article. It confirmed, the Denver Post confirmed, that the Department of Homeland Security had issued an open purchase order for 1.6 billion rounds of ammunition. As reported elsewhere, some of this purchase, and we now know most or all of the purchase, was for hollow point rounds, which are forbidden by international law for use in war. They're forbidden for use in war. Think about this. But our own Homeland Security is buying them. Enough ammunition, the final figure of 2.4 billion rounds with a B, that's about almost 8 rounds per U.S. citizen. Why in the world would they need this many bullets? The headline from the Denver Post continues, along with a frightening amount of specialized ammunition for snipers. Why would they need that? Continuing with the report, also reported elsewhere, at the height of the Iraq War, the Army was expending less than 6 million rounds a month. Therefore, 1.6 billion rounds, and we now know we're up to 2.4 billion, would be enough to sustain a hot war in the U.S. for 20 plus years. Why would they need that ammunition? And why isn't that headlines everywhere instead of Michael Jordan's fight for the price of tennis shoes on Fox News? The headline continues, and I'll finish with this point. It says, add to this the perplexing purchase of ammo. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, is now showing off its acquisition of heavily armored personnel carriers, repatriated from the Iraqi and Afghanistan theaters of operation. And the Denver Post article finishes, what is Homeland Security going to do with all that ammunition? Who is it for? End of the article. Think about that. How many people know this? That Homeland Security bought that much. We even had USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, acquiring automatic weapons. What in the world could that be for? Every governmental agency is arming itself. When will the population wake up? In fact, when will the people in these agencies wake up and quit behaving in such an incredibly tyrannical manner for their paychecks and their pensions? When will they look in the mirror and ask themselves what they've become? Let's add to this story. After we know crops collapsing, marine ecosystems collapsing, let's go back even further to 9/11, the license to invade countries to acquire resources, all knowing this was coming to a head. The power structure has known all this was coming to a head, and they're helping to drive it to a head, by the way, with things like climate engineering that are wreaking havoc on the environment. Now let's add this to the picture. Headline, Census GPS tagging your home's front door. Coordinates being taken for every residence in the nation. How many people knew or remembered or cared that in the 2010 census, every single person's point of habitation, residence, was GPSed? This headline continues. In the 2010 census is pinpointing with computer accuracy the locations and has raised considerable concern from privacy advocates who have questioned why the information is needed. The privacy advocates also are more than a little worried over what could be done with that information. Yeah, they should be worried. the government stocking up on ammunition, GPSing your front door. And in my particular case, I live very far in the wilderness. They hiked in to my doorstep, not once, but twice. Hiked almost a mile into my location twice. And I confronted the second group there, the second individual, and he's just a pawn, and I realized that, but I confronted him to consider what he was a part of, and he hadn't considered that. He had no idea, hadn't thought about why this would be being done. So now they have the ammunition, they know exactly where you're at. Let's add a little more to this. Drones deployed in U.S. This is a headline, spying on Americans, 64 drone bases on U.S. soil. Now, it's not just about spying. This particular article continues. By 2012, the Pentagon had established plans for the spread of an unmanned fleet of drones, pointing indelibly to the militarization of law enforcement and the degradation of the Posse Comitatus Act, the military establishing itself on U.S. soil. We'd like to think of the drone war as something far away, fought in the deserts of Yemen, the mountains of Afghanistan, but we know it's closer than we thought. Again, there are 64 drone bases on American soil. There's more now. This is a little bit dated. That includes 12 locations that house the Predator and Reaper unmanned aerial vehicles, which can be armed. How do the few in power, I'm asking everybody to consider this, how do the few in power control the many? Unmanned drones and the GPS location of every single citizen's living space should be a very big red flag. Ammunition, GPS in your front door, establishment of drones. When will people wake up? It's time to wake up. Ecosystems are crashing. They can't hide what's unfolding any longer. When the population understands the gravity of what's happening, the power structure will start to drop some very big shoes, and they're maneuvering their chess pieces into place now. Let's finish with a reminder of what should be our absolute priority. We're all being sprayed like insects. Countless lab tests taken at state-certified labs prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the same highly toxic heavy metals named in numerous geoengineering patents are raining down on us all. And again, in spite of how alarming everything I just went over should be, the collapsing of the biosphere, Homeland Security's purchasing of billions of rounds of hollow point ammunition, the GPSing of everybody's residence, the establishment of drones, as lethal as all that is, nothing is more lethal than those who control every breath you take. And in fact, every breath we take is laden with these materials. Medical studies and tests already prove these toxins are absolutely taking a huge toll on human and environmental health. We know this. We have lab tests to prove it from the bees that are full of aluminum. I challenge anybody to search that online. Just search bees aluminum. You'll find mainstream study. That's why the bees are collapsing, the primary reason. To human health, Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, everything I mentioned earlier. Huge toll. We are breathing mountains of toxic metals and chemicals. We can't know what they're spraying at any given moment, but the spraying is definitely getting worse overall by the day. We have reports from all over the globe. The long visible trails, important to remember this, are only a part of the equation. When there's existing cloud canopy in place, the spraying is often the heaviest because you can't see it. And that's when they really unleash it. If you live in an urban location, you wouldn't be able to hear the parade of jets that pass over during these heavy canopy days. I live in a very remote location, as I mentioned, and the jet aircraft assault is extremely audible, easy to hear, it's shocking, during already heavily covered skies. Large jets on these days can be heard flying low, directly over the canopy. They can be heard one after another after another. The sound never dies. I was once in the forest working with a habitat restoration crew on the habitat area that I have tried to restore on the east side of Lake Shasta. These are crews that were help funded with federal programs and some of my resources to do habitat restoration. I was working with a crew of 8, and within a 15-minute period of one of these heavy spray occasions with a lot of moisture, chemically nucleated snow was coming down. It was 40 degrees and there was flakes coming down. 6 of the 8 of us got nosebleeds within a 15-minute time frame. 6 of 8. What were they spraying? We can't know. And how do you think we felt out there? Everyone knew that something was going on. You start looking at each other and you have blood gushing out of your nose for no reason. On a cold winter night, also some years ago, I was alone on a mountaintop overlooking Redding, California. That's the northernmost city in California. There was an uncommon, very low-lying layer of dense fog over the whole city, but the rest of the skies were completely clear. A military tanker flew directly over my head to descended to perhaps a 5,000-foot elevation, and it was absolutely dumping. Now, this is not a condensation trail. And what was this tanker doing at such a low altitude? And it was definitely dumping. And again, a rare night where the whole city was blanketed with fog. There's no way anybody there could have seen what was happening. And interestingly enough now, Redding, California has an official chronic illness rate of nearly 50%. I don't claim to know what that tanker was dumping, but I do know it was not condensation. You don't have a condensation trail at 5,000 feet, period, that's covering the entire valley. No chance. So I want to state this. This is why climate engineering supersedes, again, even all the other threats I mentioned. No matter what other challenges we face, we must deal with what's happening above our heads. We must. If the climate, if the environment, and our own health is damaged beyond any recovery, it's game over. It's that simple. The mix of materials raining down on all of us right now is extremely toxic. At any time, consider this, at any time of the power structure's choosing, they could make this mix more lethal anytime they want. And if you think that that's not a possibility, you're not looking at facts. Trouble is not out on the horizon somewhere. People need to understand this and realize this. It's kicking the door in right now. All of us are needed in the effort to raise critical awareness of what's going on in the world, especially in regard to the climate engineering insanity and the threat it poses to each and every one of us. We must contact and appeal to agency officials, elected officials, groups, organizations, journalists, individuals, plead with them to stand out from the shadows and face the truth while there's still time to make a difference. If you're an official in an agency and you're listening right now, consider that your paycheck and your pension very soon will not matter at all. I don't expect you to believe this, but I do plead with you, if any of these agency officials or people who are in a position to make a difference are listening, I plead with you to actually investigate. If you claim to love your children, if you claim to care about their future, you have an obligation to investigate this information. It's not an option, it's an obligation, as I stated. Look in the mirror, look at your children, and consider the difference you can still make if we simply try. The human race has shown the intelligence to create miraculous technologies. There's no arguing that. But as a whole, the human race has so far lacked the wisdom to save ourselves from ourselves. There's no arguing this. Henry David Thoreau said a very long time ago, as he witnessed the destruction of the environment, even over 160 years ago. But this man of wisdom said, "Thank God men cannot fly, or they would lay waste to the sky as they have done to the earth." We've had visionaries throughout history that have seen this coming, that this human behavior that can't get enough, that can't seem to face its responsibility to the whole, and to stop contributing to the destruction. We must change courses. The time has come for a complete change of direction. It's up to all of us to implement that change. I hope GeoEngineeringWatch.org can be a tool, and we have activist suggestions on our site. Please look for the information there and what you can do to make a difference. This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org and Global Alert News. Until next week, thank you very much.